I'm going to talk a bit about science policy interfaces, but I'm going to go back to basics so that the next speakers can do the hard work. And I'm going to base this part of the presentation on, as Marie said, a lot of the work that's already been done on science policy interfaces. There's a huge amount that's been done on understanding and improving science policy interfaces, with lots of outputs out there for anybody who's interested in engaging in them. Okay, should we do that? Yeah. So the first thing I would like to do is actually explain what science policy interfaces are not. So there is still a huge amount of what we call sort of myths out there about SPIs. And I want to start this presentation with a bit of myth busting. So the first myth that's still very, very prevalent is the fact that people still see in their minds often science and policy as two very independent domains of human activity. That's not the case. The other myth that still persists, and we've had a bit of a flavor of it already in some of the comments on Mentimeter, is looking at SPIs as a one-way flow of information in which science speaks truth to power, in this case policy. And then the third myth that's incredibly prevalent is the fact that people see SPIs as these sort of simple forums through which reporting of science knowledge leads to the development of policy through optimization in these sort of clear, controllable and unproblematic ways. And all these are myths, and the problem with them is that they persist and that they actually often complicate our life when we want to engage with SPIs. So, a definition of SPIs to start us with. And this is a definition that Sibylle van den Heuvel developed back in 2007, and it's still one that we've used extensively in all our projects, and which is a really nice way of encapsulating SPIs. And it's basically the myriad ways in which scientists, policymakers, and other actors link up to communicate, to exchange ideas, and to develop knowledge jointly, to enrich policy and decision-making processes and or research. And it's a lovely definition because it's very encompassing. It highlights some of the challenges, but also some of the really wonderful things that can come out of SPIs. And so really the aim of these SPIs, seen in this way, is to improve the quality of decision-making and of knowledge production. And it basically sort of assumes that a well-functioning SPI is a necessary ingredient of more effective governance of complex issues such as biodiversity and ecosystem services aspects. But I think we need to obviously not be too naive about the whole thing. It's not a sufficient condition, of course. And we do need the existence of very strong political will and institutions, and obviously that's of crucial importance, and it's affected by lots of other factors other than knowledge. In Spiral, when we first started, we thought it would be a good idea to have a quick overview of SPIs at the European level, and we realized that there were a huge amount of SPIs active at the European and global level. And what was particularly interesting was, again, the very sort of the big differences in SPIs, from very informal ones all the way to very formal ones. So, you know, one aspect that can't be underestimated are face-to-face communications in the SPI world. Interfaces of specific projects and networks that many of us have been engaged with and active on, all the way through to much more formal processes such as international or regional assessment process like the MEA, and strategic initiatives like IPBES, which I think Sepp is obviously going to talk about later today. But it's important to realize that SPIs can operate at lots of different scales, at lots of different levels, from the individuals to networks to institutions, etc. It's really a very sort of all-encompassing aspect. The other thing that we did in Spiral was that we sort of thought to ourselves theoretically, you know, what are the sort of key features of successful SPIs? And it was really quite interesting because the more we looked into SPIs, the more we discovered that actually very, very few SPIs had all these sort of key features. But and it is a bit of an idealistic view, obviously, but it's interesting to think about what would make an SPI work? What are the key features? And the first one that's really important is obviously the goal of the SPI, to set out quite clearly why that SPI operates. The structure of it, how it's set up, the processes, i.e. how key functions of that SPI are going to be carried out, the outputs, what outputs are going to be prepared, how they're going to be presented, and then what the outcomes of the SPI are going to be. What are the expected outcomes of an SPI? Because we often have a tendency to think it's a good thing to do, but not necessarily thinking about what we want it to actually sort of come up with. And in a lot of SPIs we looked at, there were a range of different outcomes, including learning, behavioral and policy changes, ultimately with the goal of improving biodiversity governance. And so taking this a step further, what would the ideal SPI look like? And basically so I should say actually a bit of a plug here. This was all the outputs of Spiral. There are a few handbooks of Spiral at the back over there that Estelle very kindly has found in a cupboard and brought here. And I'm sure she doesn't want it back in her cupboard, so please pick them up. But we also have all this published and it's all on the website. So the first thing obviously to consider is who the audiences are going to be of the SPI, what the policy context is, what are the policy needs, what are the sort of features and strategies that are going to prioritize the impact of the SPI, etc. And then really to sort of set up a number of ongoing opportunities for and processes of exchange and learning in order to develop an SPI that's fit for purpose, that's able to reach target audiences in timely and effective ways and to maximize influence. And all this really requires a huge amount of work in developing a common language, in building trust, developing capacities to understand each other's positions, each other's views, needs and constraints, in order to then develop knowledge, processes, influence and impacts that are credible, relevant and legitimate. But of course it doesn't stop there, because it's always an iterative process. And basically you need regular stock taking and performance assessments leading to iterative improvements, because contexts change, people move. So you always have to have this sort of idea that the SPI is never going to be static. It's an incredibly dynamic environment. And obviously, in the sort of systems that we work with in terms of environmental issues, we have a number of challenges. I think we again, we need to sort of face these quite directly. We're often dealing with incredibly complex socio-ecological systems. Scientists are not always the best place to communicate, and we obviously deal with issues like social media and other factors that can often distort what we would like to communicate. The policy setting in which we work can often look incredibly opaque. So this is one exercise that we did where we thought, oh, wouldn't it be fun to look at this particular policy process in the EU and see what happens and where we can feed in and everything else. And we had to stop at this stage because there was no more room on the page. But it can, from an outsider view, seem incredibly daunting. And of course, one of the key problems that we have is that in the environmental sector, there are huge amounts of disciplines and sectors that are relevant and that we would like to work with and learn from. But we still often work in very silo-based actions, and it's quite difficult to actually get this interdisciplinarity and intersectoral activity actually on the ground. And of course, there are huge differences in values and worldviews, not only within science, not only within policy, but between science and policy. And I particularly like this little cartoon here, with the mother desperately wanting the little child and its grandpa to run along and interact. And it does feel like that sometimes with our fellow policymakers. So why bother? Well, it's incredibly difficult for researchers often to know how to engage with policy, or indeed when they do engage with policy to actually be acknowledged for carrying out that SPI work. And it means that there's often a huge amount of science that's potentially useful to policy, but currently very underused. We do increasingly have an accountability issue as scientists, with funders increasingly demanding policy impact. And really, what I've learned over the last few years is that engagement in SPIs although it does take a lot of time and it can be very frustrating, it does give researchers a much better awareness of what research is policy relevant, and therefore it increases impact and funding competitiveness. So now that I've gone through all the challenges and maybe why we should bother at all, we have also obviously focused a lot on ways forward at the science policy interface. And this is some work particularly from Biodiversity Knowledge, from our colleagues from there. And I'm going to sort of look through those sort of 5 key ways forward very quickly, because everybody wants a coffee break and Allan needs to talk about eclipse. So the first issue is to have a really strong focus on process. And why is this important? It's because people engaging with the SPI may need to go about knowledge transfer differently from how it's been approached in the past. Things have changed and things need to be different. But what needs to be clear is that from the start, we need to be clear about what will be done and how to better transfer that knowledge. And a few suggestions for that are to ensure in projects, for example, that coordinating teams have a wide range of skills, including a few intermediaries if possible. To design different levels of interaction that help meet different needs of policymakers. Again, policymakers are not a homogeneous group. They will have different needs, and those needs need to be clarified and tailored to. And of course, allow resource allocation. All this takes a huge amount of time and energy and resources that can't be underestimated. Including different groups is a very key factor. And why is this important? It's really important because a wide range of expertise, skills and knowledge sources and knowledge types, so not just scientific knowledge, this is very important to highlight, are essential to ensure that the overall success of the policy interface are met. And here was some work that we did co-producing knowledge with gamekeepers and landowners together with scientists to better understand what was happening with certain birds in the moorlands. But the fact is that, again, we need to use very appropriate methods for integration. And again, that'll depend on who you're interacting with, what your resources are, etc. So a really big sort of amount of thought needs to go into that. And we need to ensure representation of cultures and groups in these expert groups. So having very broad calls and incentivizing people to actually sort of interact with that work. And of course, again, include different types of experts from the start of the process. The third aspect is obviously communication. That came out already in the little word cloud. Why is this important? I mean, it's self-intuitive, but information needs and communication styles will vary. People will respond better to certain things, other groups might not. And effective communication can enhance transparency, which is absolutely key to building trust. And trust is one of those things in SPIs that you just can't get away from. And as we see, in the media, you have lots of different aspects of communication, not always beneficial, but our role is really to put that, to communicate more effectively. And, involve communication specialists. It's their job, they're good at it. Why not involve them to help out? Use terminology and definitions very clearly and consistently. I mean, we're our worst enemy at this. Increase transparency and develop guidelines for different groups. Really try and target those groups in ways that will work best for them. Usable outputs for policy. I mean, it's astonishing how we still see reports come out that are, the size of a brick and as heavy as one, and that no policymaker is going to look through the whole thing, right? The idea is really to develop usable outputs for the policy community in order to inform the decision-making process. And that's essential to be considered from the very start, as opposed to a sort of end-of-pipe activity that suddenly you think, oh, yes, we need to provide a usable output for policy, because it's probably going to be too late at that point. So again, include loads of other knowledge sources like grey literature, not necessarily in English. Let's be much broader. Developing understanding on the policy context, decision-making processes, and policy language on the science side, to speak their language. Develop mutual understanding of complexities and uncertainties on the policy side. Identify the target audiences really early on, what their information needs are and what their communication preferences are. You can just ask them. And also plan to meet the needs of the requesters within the time and budget available. Really sort of looking at it from their perspective. And finally, building capacity. And why this is important is because capacity building is a continuous process of improvement, involving a joined-up approach at the individual, institutional, and wider systems level. And again, it's really important to improve understanding and trust and to build those bridges between groups and reduce gaps in knowledge. And again, there are lots of things that we can do to improve capacity building, providing a range of skills and expertise in the coordinating team, providing expertise on the use of research tools and methods, because not everybody knows about all the research tools and methods that we use, and it's a really useful exercise to do. Develop the capacity to include different knowledge sources and different knowledge types. Again, really important and very, very valuable. And integrate a critical evaluation process to facilitate reflection and learning. So I know that that's a lot to think about, but again, it's all in various sources, and please don't hesitate to ask questions about it. And now I'm going to hand over to Allan to present the Eclipse project, which he's going to talk about. So I don't need to.
Hey, thank you very much. It's so nice to be here amongst. Whoops. Did I move that forward? Yeah, it's so nice to be here amongst friends and colleagues, and this has got a mind of its own, this thing. Oh. Oh, it's this thing. Well, you've seen my talk already. Okay, so this is, I should have talked to you before we started, shouldn't I? Okay, thank you very much, Marie, for the invitation. As I was trying to say, it is so nice to meet amongst friends and colleagues, and actually in passing to remember one or two people, such as Felix, who are no longer with us, who made such a difference in this particular area. So I'd like to, this isn't my first slide. Do I go back? Yeah, there we go. Try not to touch anything. So I'd like to talk about Eclipse, which is both a project and a vision. A project in the sense that it's got this aim to build innovative, light, self-sustainable EU support mechanism for evidence-informed policy on biodiversity and ecosystem services. But it's a vision as well, because the vision is to hand this over to the wider community once the project ends. No, this button here. Okay, so it's a project, a Horizon 2020 project, a CSA, Community Support Action, running for another year, started in February 2016, with 10 partner institutions. Those 10 partners are not the S in the SPI, they're not the science and the science policy interface, but those partners are there to facilitate the engagement of scientists, practitioners, and policymakers. Eclipse is also seen as a step along a road. Eclipse has got a history, indeed a prehistory, and I think it's worth going back, all the way back to the start of the EPBRS, European Platform for Biodiversity Research Strategy, which was Martin Charman's idea when he was working in the European Commission. And his idea was to bring scientists and policymakers together, ideally one of each from every country that was eligible for European Union funding, and to get them together to talk about research priorities on particular biodiversity issues. And it was extremely successful. It led to a large number of projects, including the Alarm project, which Joseph led, and a number of others. EPBRS was also fairly successful in engaging with a wide range of policymakers, such as the European Commission DG Environment, and was in dialogue at the very earliest stages in the discussion of the first European biodiversity strategy. And it's no surprise that the idea of this policy support mechanism appeared as a recommendation in the 2006 biodiversity strategy. So those things don't happen overnight, but eventually the European Commission funded the Spiral project and the Biodiversity Knowledge project, and is now funding the Eclipse project. So what does Eclipse do? It's got 5 functions. It sets out to answer key questions from policymakers and others, to identify current and future emerging issues. The pollinator issue has been with us for some time, and judging by the newspapers at the moment, people are waking up to the fact there are more insects than pollinators out there, and there's a serious issue with them. So that's kind of that sort of emerging issue that Eclipse seeks to work with others on. It seeks to create a responsive and active network, getting back to this network of networks idea. An active network which will respond to the requests that Eclipse receives. Not to create a new network so much as to link existing networks. Fourthly, to help to improve citizens' engagement, to provide a voice for people that is obvious from demonstrations such as this in Brussels every week at the moment, that are not having a voice, and to link with international science policy initiatives such as the Convention on Biological Diversity and IPBES, which Joseph will talk about later. So that's Eclipse in a nutshell, but even more briefly, this is my favorite way of describing Eclipse, which is a quote from Juliette's daughter, Zoe. Eclipse helps bring together people who know to help other people who need to know. So I could stop there and we could go for coffee, but I'll continue after Juliette takes a photograph. We do like to complicate things though, don't we? And when, so this actually it's more difficult to do a slide which captures a process than the process itself, which is not as difficult as this suggests. I won't go through it all, you'll be pleased to learn, but if you go to the website, there's a lovely video which describes the request process in detail. But I'll use it to illustrate a few advantages of the Eclipse approach. First of all, the Eclipse approach responds directly to policy and other actors' knowledge needs through regular calls for requests. So that's how the whole process kicks off. Secondly, the Eclipse approach frames questions directly with those requesters to better understand what knowledge they need and by when and in what format and so on. For example, two requests that we received in Eclipse. One from IUCN and the other from the Swedish Board of Agriculture, which were put together, and they focused on trying to identify measures which support biodiversity in the Common Agricultural Policy. And after dialogue with them, this was reformulated to focus more on farmer uptake. What is it that drives farmers to take up particular measures or not? Thirdly, then, the Eclipse approach builds on existing knowledge and links requests for knowledge to the most relevant knowledge holders. So it does this through calls for knowledge, which fit into requests, and it does it in the reviewing process, reviews of protocols and reviews of draft reports, and notably through calls for experts. So if you were looking at the website last June, you would have seen this on the website, several calls, including calls for a protocol review. Yeah, and in particular, calls for experts to form the expert working groups, which are used for most of the Eclipse requests. Fourthly, it's worth mentioning the methods expert working group of Eclipse, which suggests the most relevant methods to match requesters' needs. In addition to doing so, something that was unforeseen at the start, the methods expert group have published this report, which covers 21 different knowledge synthesis methods. And if you don't want to wade through the whole report, there are practical information on each of those methods separately on the website. Finally, the Eclipse approach builds its activities on a strong ethical infrastructure and a strong focus on networking and institutional support. There isn't really time to talk about all the requests, as coffee is getting ever closer. Suffice to say that at times I think that Eclipse has been somewhat overwhelmed by the amount of interest that there has been. The first request came from the European Commission, and the request concerned the projects that DG Research and Innovation were funding on nature-based solutions. And their issue was they wanted a way of evaluating these projects. So Eclipse set up this expert working group with nearly 120 applicants. And in 8 months, they produced a report, which the European Commission has found very useful in the work that's followed it. Not all, well, a fair number of requests have come from the European Commission, but some have come from NGOs. One example is this request on bug life, who were interested in the impacts of electromagnetic radiation on insects and biodiversity generally. And now, given the relative lack of information on this particular topic, Eclipse published 2 reports, one covering the work that's been done to date, and the other with recommendations on future research in this area. A key aspect of this was a web conference, and notably there's been extensive media coverage on it. Finally, worth mentioning the request on the diverse values of nature and their incorporation in decision making, which came from Client Earth. Now, given the amount of academic work that has gone in this area and is going on again now, notably in an IPBES working group, Eclipse focused on the societal engagement here, testing out different types of science cafe approaches. And perhaps it's a good moment to pause and say that probably that has been the biggest challenge that Eclipse has faced and is facing, how to get better societal engagement in this science policy society interface. As I said, there isn't enough time to talk about all the requests. There have been 3 calls, 5 requests are completed, and 8 are in process at the moment. There isn't enough time to talk about the capacity building initiatives, which are also request driven, or to talk about the various tools. I've already mentioned the knowledge synthesis methods. There's also an excellent guide on organising horizon scanning activities, which was done jointly with the Joint Research Centre. And there isn't enough time to talk about the ethical infrastructure, but I think Marie will talk about this in more detail in a future seminar. So in summary, I think we can say that already that the Eclipse approach works for policy and research. It's from a policy perspective, it's based on years of research and the challenges of the science policy interface, not only involving the projects and the people that have been mentioned or are here today, but a lot of others. Is shown to provide outputs that decision makers use in relevant format and timescale. Regarding timescale, that of course is an issue, but the philosophy of Eclipse is to tap into all relevant knowledge and to give all relevant knowledge holders the opportunity to integrate, and that takes time. And finally, the Eclipse approach involves robust and transparent processes important for decision making. From a research perspective, Eclipse is already engaged with over 500 scientists, policymakers, and others. And this is the benefit of increasing researchers' knowledge on the policy process, increased researchers' own networks, and led to giving them the opportunity to demonstrate impact. What comes next? Eclipse has followed the model of the Biodiversity Knowledge Project in having a work package specifically dedicated to evaluating its processes to allow it to adapt as the project goes along. And Eclipse has a year left to continue to adapt. Eclipse aims to hand over this legacy to the broader community, and indeed has started to do so. An important part of its governance is the Knowledge Coordination Body, most of whose members are not consortium, are not involved in the consortium partners. So that independence is already built into Eclipse. And finally, researchers don't like to talk about money, but processes like this are not cheap. And Eclipse has a business planning group which has developed a business plan or a rollout plan which will help design the next steps. So money is important, but initiatives such as this need engagement to succeed. Eclipse is lucky enough to be led by Marie and Juliette, and there's an excellent team of people working on the project here, working after everyone else has gone home. And in addition to that, the many expert working groups and others have already very actively engaged in Eclipse. And it's this level of engagement that makes me so positive about the future, because for Eclipse to succeed, it does need their engagement, your engagement. For further information, please talk to any of the people involved in Eclipse, of which are quite a few people here today, or look at our websites. Thank you very much.